Welcome back to the history of video games, part 3. Today we'll take a look at the second generation of video game consoles and look at the rise and fall of the Atari company. Before we start though, a little note on these texts and pictures and things that I keep throwing in here. They're here just basically to aid you. I just don't want this video series to be just me talking, which of course is what it is because it's a webcam series, but still. Also, I use the text basically to keep you awake and also to share some important terms and things that I don't have time to stop and explain. So, I hope that doesn't bother anybody. I try to make the series as interesting for everyone as possible, and if you have suggestions about how to make this series much more interesting, go ahead and put those in the comments as well. Of course, I'm putting in background music and things like that as well. So last time, the Pong era came to an end in 1977 with the arrival of the Atari 2600. It would seem kind of obvious why the Atari 2600 would be such a superior system over the different Pong machines that had come before, but a thing worth noting, of course, is that there were in fact a couple of different console manufacturers that did try to offer something other than Pong. But again, just because you're first doesn't make you the best. Really, Atari's success came down to some really good timing, to be honest. Remember, this is 1977, the Pong home console came out in 1972. For the past 6 years, people had been playing nothing but Pong, so it was really the right time for Atari to bring in this completely new system which had color, sound, and which had multiple different games. And really, what it was effectively an arcade machine in your home. Video arcades were finally taking off in a big way in the late 70s. In really not just the United States, but in Japan in particular, like I mentioned last time with the Taito and Space Invaders. And if we think about the major technical innovation, what really separates this second console generation from the first console generation is actually most of the Pong machines that came out before didn't actually have microprocessors of any kind. They were quite literally just chipsets running off of electrical current. So yes, a machine the size of a bread box had the technical sophistication of a digital watch. And the Atari 2600 really went off to great success, crazy, enormous success, and the reason for this was that there wasn't a serious contender on the market at the time when it was released. Like I mentioned, Magnavox did release the Odyssey 2, but it was marketed as partially a home computer, and that unfortunately was still a very small market at this time, even though it was a growing one. You are the only seriously thought of video game system in a market like this for 3 years. That's an advantage that no company, not even Sega, ever had. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about the only serious contender to the Atari 2600? Well, of course I'm talking about the Mattel company's Intellivision system that was made in 1980. Now, I did say that rule before. A video game console that tries to be like a computer spells instant disaster, and that was what the Intellivision was originally envisioned as. That's what the name stands for, Intelligent Television. But Mattel was smart enough to realize maybe we should just release games for this thing and kind of leave that computer stuff to the other guys. I mean, this was really what helped it, because the Intellivision was 3 years ahead of the Atari technologically. I mean, seriously, it was just a much more advanced system overall. And the Intellivision did achieve notable market success, although unfortunately Intellivision only ever sold about a third of the amount of consoles that the Atari 2600 did, so it did come in a little too late, and especially considering how this console generation ends, it was kind of unfortunate overall. But the Intellivision did provide us with one other serious platform besides the Atari to have games being released on, and this is really the beginning of multi-platformism. This was the first time that multiple video game companies started releasing their games for multiple systems, and there were many other video game systems besides the Intellivision and the Atari that were around, but Intellivision and Atari really were the two big ones. And as mentioned last time, when something is popular, copy it. That's exactly what the Coleco Toy Company did in 1982 when they released the ColecoVision, which did become the third best-selling console of its generation, which is A notable achievement, although, as you can tell if you just look at it, it was pretty much a blatant ripoff of the Intellivision technologically. But the ColecoVision still does have a loyal following, and in fact, if we think about it, the ColecoVision was actually envisioned as a gamer system. Although, again, this came out 2 years after the Intellivision, so I guess Coleco had kind of had their ear to the ground for a while now, and were thinking now would be the good time to jump in. So it seems like things were really hunky-dory for the video game industry. All these new companies coming out with all kinds of new games, arcades are flourishing, games are being released on multiple systems at the same time that are selling like hotcakes, although I've never actually met a person who's bought a hotcake. In other words, it seems like the wheels are turning, like the video game market has really like expanded tremendously since the days of Pong. So how the hell did this all come crashing down? It's sort of ironic that the company that really started all of this craziness was also the company that very nearly ended it. Yes, it all comes back to Atari, and of course the second generation of video game consoles culminates and ends with the horrific event that was the video game crash of 1984. And what caused the video game crash of 1984? You may think that it was this. But that's only really part of the answer. First of all, we have to remember something that did not exist at this time. There was no such thing as a licensing agreement, which meant that you had the physical means to create games for a video game console, you could just pretty much do that. And this is what happened. A lot of times, companies just acquired through some means, but usually not by going to the console manufacturers themselves, the technology and the necessary equipment to make games for a system. What happened really was that there was no quality control, there was no limits to how many games could be released for any one system. In fact, most times companies would start making games for multiple systems at the same time. They would all come out at the same time, and when you think about this, that there's no limitations on this, you know what's gonna happen, don't you? It means that the market is gonna get flooded with thousands of games. And from Atari's point of view, this was all a good thing. I mean, people just want to play more video games, so let's keep on making more consoles and things should go well. Atari, although are a company that can be credited for really, in effect, creating the video game market, unfortunately, they are not the best example of good business practices. In fact, they are the complete opposite. They are the crowning example of horrible, bad business practices. Now, E.T. is often pointed at as the thing that broke the proverbial camel's back, but Atari had been headed into trouble for a long time before E.T. even came along. First of all, we had these video game competitions that Atari was holding with these absolutely crazy prizes that they were giving out, and of course, acquiring the licenses to games based on movies and things like that was pretty freaking expensive at this time. And as mentioned before, Atari did have a lot of merchandise that wasn't getting sold. The shopkeepers, of course, are gonna go like, I think I'm gonna be losing some money off of this. Not to mention, Atari had attempted to make a generation jump already at this point in time. The Atari 5200 was intended as the official follow-up for the 2600. Unfortunately, the 5200 will only be remembered as one of Atari's biggest failures. I mean, yes, it was a backwards compatible system with performance pretty much equal to the Intellivision and ColecoVision, which were its biggest competitors at this point, except that it also had a broken joystick, which of course made it completely unplayable. And Atari thought, well, no big deal, we just throw this bitch out and just keep on making more 2600 games. Except at this point in time is when E.T. came into the picture. And when it failed, Atari found itself entirely bankrupt. Which is the answer to the question I gave all of you last time. Really, how can you go bankrupt if you are the biggest selling console manufacturer of your generation? But really, all of this stuff that Atari did only affected Atari. You might wonder then, how could the video game market crash if only one company failed? Well, Atari was the biggest video game company And when they failed, every other video game manufacturer looked at themselves and said, oh shit, we're gonna end up the same way. Let's stop this foolishness. Many people viewed video games as just a trend that was going to disappear, and in 1984, it seemed like the trend was dying out, because Mattel, Coleco, and every other company just bowed out. Why go on? Of course, this just pissed off American retailers even more. Now they had no way of getting their money back from all this merchandise that was never sold. So basically, it also meant that that anybody who was even thinking of releasing a video game system at this point was not going to find any support. So yes, the video game crash of 1984 happened for one reason only: Atari going bankrupt. Now we talk about the video game crash of 1984 as this sort of a big apocalyptic event that pretty much killed video games all over the world. But in fact, if you believe that, you have a very skewed and limited view of what the video game market actually is. One of the things that had actually formed during this console generation was the general three major market areas of video gaming. Now, excuse the crudity of this map, which I hope will illustrate my point. When we think about the video game crash of 1984, the area that was actually most affected was North America. That's how people usually view this event, that America is the center of the world and everything else is just kind of on the sidelines. But we have to remember, even though the console industry was devastated by the 1985 video game crash, arcade businesses were actually still going on, because really you're still making direct profit out of every coin that people throw into your machines. And especially over at Europe, the computer gaming industry was about to get into full swing. In the early 1980s, the Commodore 64 and the Sinclair ZX Spectrum were about to become massively popular home computer systems, which also happened to be very popular computer game platforms, and a lot of European game developers were beginning to emerge at this point. And of course, we can't forget about this little island off the coast of China, where not only was arcade business still thriving, only a few years earlier, the very first console manufacturer emerged from this country. My question for next time: how old is Nintendo? See you on the next one.